Week 3 Entrepreneurial Context. Lecture 2 Institutional Effects. In the first lecture, we look at the diversity of contexts and forms of entrepreneurial activity. In the second lecture, we are going to continue to look at the diverse factors and contexts and processes of entrepreneurial activity, choices, and outcomes. In this second presentation, we will ask how institutional forces and factors impact on entrepreneurial activity. Entrepreneurial choices are affected by numerous factors and forces. These are the institutional forces, including social, cultural, geographical, economic, and legal dimensions. In other words, entrepreneurship takes place everywhere. However, it may look very different because of all these different institutional, environment, and context.
Today's presentation focuses entirely on the concept of institutional effects on entrepreneurial activity. We want to look at this because whether just as people living day to day or as scholars, we notice that entrepreneurship tends to look very different in different locations. We can imagine, for example, that entrepreneurial activity in Edinburgh, and specifically associated with the University of Edinburgh, tends to look very different than entrepreneurial activity in places like Beijing. And so we might want to ask ourselves, what are the underlying factors that influence entrepreneurial choices and entrepreneurial activity in different geographical or national countries? The way we address this is by talking about institutions. And institutions can refer to a specific organization, but it also can be an established law, practice, or custom, or simply something associated with the context in which activity takes place. So right now, what we're going to focus on is primarily the cost of getting a business started. And the reason we look at this is because this directly influences entrepreneurial decisions to start ventures. So if we think about the cost and paperwork to start a business, we might notice that in the United States, for example, in particular in the state of Wisconsin, it costs about $130 and takes about 30 minutes to actually create the legal venture. Although the steps to starting a company in the United Kingdom are not significantly more expensive, and in some ways can be actually less expensive, there is a fairly significant series of steps that has to be undertaken. And I've placed a link here for you to follow if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. Broadly speaking, we can look at how much it costs. And so here is a visual representation of the relative cost of starting businesses in Europe. And we can see that there are some countries in which the cost of starting business is relatively high. Places, for example, like Italy and Greece. And there are places where the cost of starting a business is extremely low. Places, for example, such as Ireland. And these are driven by a number of factors. They may be driven by the amount of paperwork, the actual monetary costs of getting a business off the ground. Part of this is due, of course, to the types of structures that are in place. And it's likely that in countries where there are significantly higher costs of starting a business, some of those costs may be associated with non-official processes that must be undertaken in order to get a business off the ground. And sometimes these are related to problems that governments face dealing with corruption or poorly defined legal systems and so on. But regardless, all of these things affect entrepreneurial decisions. So let's be very explicit about these types of institutions that can affect entrepreneurial decision-making. Clearly, government policies, such as the cost and ease of incorporation, can have an effect. But also there can be indirect effects of things like taxation on marginal earnings. For example, if you are the owner of a business and your company will have to pay corporate taxes on its profits, and then any residual profits that are then distributed to shareholders pay additional taxes, then there's a perceived higher cost of being a successful business owner than there are to potentially being an employee. And the rate of taxes and the enforcement of these kinds of taxation policies ultimately do affect entrepreneurial decision-making and behavior at the marginal level. The legal system can have a significant impact on entrepreneurial activity, whether because it helps preserve rights and protects individuals for their ethical behavior, whether it provides justice and remuneration for unethical business behavior, whether it provides patent protection for innovation, or alternately, if the legal system, for example, tends to reward unethical behavior, such as software pirating, that impacts how individuals, entrepreneurs, make decisions for starting a business and where they choose to run their business. Culture can have a very significant effect on entrepreneurial decision-making. Family and community expectations, a perceived stigma of failure, networking requirements, and even things like gender and ethnic biases can have a very significant effect on where and how individuals choose to start organizations. Two of the more commonly understood impacts on entrepreneurial activity are the financial system, and specifically access to capital, and the economic system, such as the mechanisms for growth and expansion, and the incentives for exits. For example, if the only way to exit a business is by selling the business, and there's no mechanism, for example, for an initial public offering, taking the business public, again, all of these things can affect the types of decisions that individuals make when they're considering starting a venture. If we then think about once the venture is actually functioning, how easy is it to do business? That is, what is the relative cost of operating a business compared in one country compared to another? And we see that in this particular study, which is also from the World Bank, I believe, we can look at how a number of different factors are implemented across a variety of countries. These include things like how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to deal with construction permits, electricity and utilities, registering property, credit, protecting investors from outside lawsuits, for example, taxation, trading across borders and things like import-export taxes, the legal costs of enforcing contracts, and ultimately resolving insolvency. And you can see that these vary dramatically across different countries. And so, for example, in the United Kingdom, it would appear that getting credit is relatively easy. However, enforcing contracts or getting electricity can be surprisingly difficult. And so we see that the ease of doing business in a number of places, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, the United States, are considered to be relatively easy. And of course, we don't have on here, because I only wanted to provide the top countries in terms of ease of doing business. But if you go to this website, you can see some of the countries that fall much lower, and you can see some of the reasons, some of the specific challenges that entrepreneurs would face in those countries. One country that has gained a reputation as being a problematic place for entrepreneurial activity is Russia. And there are probably many reasons for this and many different effects that are taking place. But I wanted to point out one that's been in the news, in fact, not just this story, but other stories in the news, in which entrepreneurs and businessmen have found themselves on the wrong side of the law for a variety of reasons. Now, I'm not privy to the details of any of these kinds of stories, including the story of Alexei Kozlov, but there does seem to be a concern that entrepreneurs in particular face unusual challenges in terms of the potential for actually being thrown in jail at some point. And so here the title of this particular BBC News magazine article was "Why Russia Locks Up So Many Entrepreneurs." Now, if you actually read this article, you'll discover that's a little bit misleading. That's not as much what it talks about. But there's no doubt that if you looked up Russia, an entrepreneur on Google, you discover a surprising number of stories in which Russian entrepreneurs have found themselves in jail. And as you might imagine, there are probably it's hard to imagine a worse disincentive for entrepreneurs than the possibility that their very success, that is their ability to function in a fairly difficult economic context and generate a lot of value, create value for themselves and their shareholders, regardless of whether this is entirely above board or not, but could be a factor in their getting put in prison. And you might imagine that at the margin, some would-be entrepreneurs might decide that perhaps it's not the best possible career choice. All of these kinds of things can also be linked to other outcomes, such as innovation. And one way of looking at this is by thinking about how outcomes such as patents and venture capital are distributed around the world. And so here, without getting into too much detail, we can see that there tends to be concentration of certain types of activity that's very closely linked with innovation and entrepreneurship. And we see that IT employment and patents and venture capital tend to accumulate in certain areas. And this is often referred to as a clustering process, and it's something that you could look at from a science and technology studies perspective, but it's only useful for enforcing this idea that entrepreneurial activity is not evenly distributed around the world, and the types of entrepreneurial activity is not evenly distributed around the world. And these effects are probably linked to some of the institutional forces that we've already been talking about. And so if you're planning on starting an IT business, the reality is that you may have to carefully consider where you're starting it, because some of the benefits and systems that you might need to access in order to effectively grow and develop your business may be more easily obtainable in some geographic areas than in other geographic areas. A final thought has to do with globalization and whether or not this issue of location is actually going to be relevant much longer. There are a number of different effects developing out of globalization processes, things like the virtualization of work, broad economic globalization that spans national boundaries, the availability of relatively cheap transportation for both people and goods, and the ability to substitute virtual activities for transportation in some cases, such as video conferencing, the readily available ICT internet services in most places around the world. But we can also think about other possible inhibitor effects, things like religious radicalization and the development of new trade pacts that might affect trade across national boundaries. And it might be useful for you to think about exactly what impact all of these might have on an entrepreneurial venture and whether it's different for different types of ventures. For example, how might these things affect a developer of mobile apps versus how might these factors affect a biotechnology company? Ultimately, you might sort of come to the conclusion that none of it really matters. But I think that at the point that you've started a venture and that your venture has potential either international aspirations or international partnerships, or you even just simply have to consider which legal framework you'd like your organization to function, you might discover that some of these are actually quite important. And you might begin to see broader patterns in how technology, innovation, and entrepreneurial activity has developed around the world. We've covered the following subtopics in this presentation. We've really just looked at how institutional forces can affect entrepreneurial choices and outcomes, and we've thought about why entrepreneurship may look very different in different places. If you've not already done so, you should review the assigned readings for this topic. I encourage you to discuss these topics with your colleagues, and you might consider listening to these presentations with your project group, as that provides an excellent opportunity to discuss and debate ideas and information from the presentations. If you have questions about this audio presentation, the course materials, or other administrative aspects of the course, please do contact the course administrator. Thanks for participating in this presentation. I hope it's given you some ideas about why entrepreneurship looks different in different parts of the world. My name is Adam J. Bach, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.